I'd like to see the United States disappear. I'd like to see it become part of Mexico, part of a huge new nation dominated by a Chicano majority. Chicano scholar and activist Charles Trujillo. Some years ago, I witnessed a demonstration in Southern California by a group of American Latinos waving Mexican flags. Clearly, these Americans identified more with Mexico than with the United States. I was initially puzzled about why Americans felt this way. If they wanted to move to Mexico, they certainly could. I was not aware of any border restrictions preventing Americans from getting into Mexico. Then I realized why these Latinos don't make the move. They think they are living in Mexico, the part of Mexico that was illegally seized and occupied by the United States. For many Americans, the Mexican War in the mid-19th century may seem like ancient history. But just as some Southerners haven't gotten over the Civil War, these Hispanics haven't gotten over the Mexican War. Unlike the Southerners, who seem reconciled to having lost their war, the Hispanics want to undo the effects of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the treaty that ceded half of Mexico to the United States. Even so, they don't want to become Mexicans again. Rather, these American Latinos seek to create a new country encompassing northern Mexico and the southwestern United States, a place they call Aztlan. Aztlan is derived from Aztec and is supposed to recall the land where the great Aztec Empire once thrived. During that demonstration, I engaged in conversation an illegal immigrant from Mexico, and he made a passionate plea that has stayed with me since. He said, "The United States grabbed half of Mexico out of a pure lust for land. Most of what we call the Southwest, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, and parts of Utah, Nevada, and Colorado, was part of Mexico. We are Mexican people, and this used to be our land before the United States invaded our country and took it. We still consider the land to be ours by right, yet the Americans won't let us return and do agricultural labor on land that once belonged to us. How wicked can people be that they take something that is yours, and then they won't even let you work and support your family on the land of your fathers?" I still recall the wistful face of the man who said that. The issue he raised wasn't one I'd considered before, nor has it gone away since. Today, leading Hispanic intellectuals and activists form part of a progressive coalition that presses the same argument. These Hispanics, however, are not wistful. They are angry, and they are here not to beg, but to insist. Contemporary activists like Angel Gutierrez, Rodolfo Acuna, and Armando Navarro attribute America's size and wealth to its lust for conquest. Acuna's standard textbook, assigned in numerous American schools and colleges, is titled Occupied America. The title refers to America's acquisition of half of Mexico and also to Hispanic reoccupation of America. What these activists want is a restoration of land that was taken, not necessarily to Mexico, but to American Hispanics. And if the whites don't give it, these activists believe that the Hispanic population will soon become the majority group in the Southwest. Then it will be in a position to take it. Immigration, legal and illegal, is the mechanism that today's progressive organizers are counting on to undo the consequences of the Mexican War and make the dream of Aztlan a reality. Hispanic activists offer different versions of the Aztlan solution. In Albuquerque, New Mexico, I met Charles Trujillo, a former professor at the University of New Mexico, to interview him for the America film. Trujillo conceded that, strictly speaking, the Aztlan idea is a myth. The Chicanos of the 1960s, he says, talked about how they were originally Aztecs and how they wanted to recover the territory of the Aztec Empire. Even today, he says, many Hispanics get together to do Aztec dances and relive the Aztec fantasy. But the Aztecs, Trujillo points out, did not inhabit what is now the southwestern United States. They were farther south, in present-day Mexico. Yet Trujillo says Aztlan represents a metaphorical truth. The Southwest, what Americans call the Southwest, is actually El Norte, the northern part of Mexico that America stole by force. This theft, Trujillo says, has to be rectified. For many years he flirted with a land-grant solution. This would require the United States to restore to Mexicans the lands originally granted by the Spanish government when Spain ruled Mexico. Essentially, Hispanics would be given large tracts of land in the United States, similar to Indian reservations. Hispanics, like native Indians, would become an autonomous nation within a nation. Today, however, Trujillo has a new solution. His new solution is for the United States and Mexico to combine into a single great nation. Over time, he excitedly says, this would become a Hispanic nation, not an Anglo or white nation. Moreover, this solution doesn't require a war. It is, in a sense, happening naturally, through immigration and higher Hispanic birth rates. Trujillo assures me that eventually the border between the United States and Mexico will simply disappear. History, he concludes, has a way of settling old scores. Armando Navarro is chairman of the Ethnic Studies Department at the University of California at Riverside. He sports a drawing of Che Guevara in his office and also a photo of him posing with Fidel Castro. In 2001, Navarro led a group of Chicanos and Mexicans at the Zapatista March into Mexico City. He said he wanted to demonstrate our solidarity with the indigenous people of Mexico. Navarro argues that Mexicans were victims of an imperialism by which Mexico lost half its territory. Today, he says, the Latino vote is powerful enough to be the swing vote in elections. Tomorrow, it will be in a position to realize Aztlan. After all, the end of the Soviet Empire created new possibilities, from the breakup of Yugoslavia to reassertions of Chechen independence. The same could happen here. Imagine the possibility that Mexico recovers the lost territories, or that a new Republic of Aztlan is established. Navarro calls for Hispanics to do to the Americans what the Americans did to their Mexican ancestors. The Americans took the land by force, and now the Hispanics can take it back. Navarro does not consider himself a secessionist. His point is that the Mexicans, unlike the Southerners, never agreed to join the American Union. Since the original conquest was illegitimate, the establishment of Aztlan is justified, however it is obtained. Hispanics are not seceding from America. They are simply getting back what originally belonged to them. America is the usurper that is being compelled to return its stolen territory. There is, however, an irony to these calls for land repatriation. I alluded to it in my chapter on Native Indians, but it reemerges here even more strongly. America, in a sense, is being accused of a double theft. Allegedly, we stole the country from the Indians, and then we stole a large part of Mexico from the Hispanics. Yet if the two continents of North and South America once belonged to the native Indians, then how did the Hispanics become owners of that land? There is a simple answer. They conquered it. Historian Patricia Limerick points out in The Legacy of Conquest that the Hispanic presence in the Southwest was itself a product of conquest. The Pueblo Indians found themselves living in occupied America long before the Hispanics did. The term Hispanic refers to Spain, and Latino derives from the term Latin. So these terms refer to Spanish people from Europe who see themselves as descended from the Latin-speaking Romans. The Spanish then interbred with the locals, producing a mestizo or mixed-race Latino group. Hispanics, or Latinos, are a mixed-race people who trace their ancestry to the Spanish conquest of the Americas. Yet if the Spanish illicitly seized the land from the Indians, then the land doesn't actually belong to them. If America cannot claim title to land by conquest, then neither can the people from whom it was taken, who themselves took it from someone else. We often think of the Mexican War as one between the powerful Americans and the poor, defenseless Mexicans. In this progressive narrative, the Americans are intoxicated by the Monroe Doctrine and Manifest Destiny, seizing land as they expand west, building the new country through the age-old mechanism of seizure and confiscation, and then dominating and exploiting the other nations of Central and South America. In his book, The Audacity of Hope, Obama railed against the Monroe Doctrine, which he defined as the notion that we could preemptively remove governments not to our liking. And recently, Secretary of State John Kerry announced in a speech to the Organization of the American States that, as far as the Obama administration was concerned, the era of the Monroe Doctrine is over. Both Obama and Kerry seem ignorant of what the Monroe Doctrine really means, or the context in which it was articulated. In reality, America, having freed itself from British colonial rule, had to contend with a continent that was the playground of empire, with the British, the French, and the Spanish all vying for land and supremacy. The Monroe Doctrine was a defense of the independence of the nations of the Americas from new attempts at European colonial rule, the doctrine stating that the United States would consider such impositions of foreign rule as belligerent actions to which the United States would have to respond. It was not an assertion of United States ownership of the Americas, but rather a warning to the European powers to leave the New World alone. Progressives insist that, in practice, the United States became the behemoth of the Western Hemisphere, regarding the Caribbean and Latin America as its backyard. Yet if this is so, why does America have so little control over its backyard? Why are there so many independent nations in Central and South America, not to mention Mexico itself, that enjoy full sovereignty and frequently defy their powerful neighbor to the north? By the end of the Mexican War, American troops had captured Mexico City. The whole country was in the possession of the United States, so from one perspective the United States took half of Mexico, from another the United States returned half of Mexico which it could have kept for itself. We cannot assess the legitimacy of these actions and the claims for reparations that inevitably accompany them without examining what really happened. And recalling our effort to do history from below, we must throughout these inquiries concentrate on the fate of the little guy. Manifest destiny was a term first used by John O'Sullivan in 1845 in the Democratic Review. Sullivan argued that if America expanded from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific, this would increase both its security and prosperity. Sullivan said it was America's manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions. Sullivan's point was that tens of millions of people were being ejected from Europe as a consequence of famine and hardship, and they were landing in America in search of a better life. Why, he asked, did these teeming millions from Ireland, Scandinavia, and elsewhere have any less right to land than the Spanish, whose only claim was that they conquered it first? Admittedly, at the time Sullivan wrote this, Mexico had fought off the Spanish and won its war of independence. Still, Mexico was controlled by mestizo oligarchs, themselves of partial Spanish descent. Abraham Lincoln described the Mexican government as a mixture of tyranny and anarchy. The life of the ordinary Mexican was difficult and insecure, not only because of poverty but also because of government-sanctioned corruption and seizure of land and goods. Property rights were based on an antiquated land grant system that was capriciously enforced. Political rights were few and civil rights non-existent. So despite Mexican independence, the Mexicans themselves had virtually no rights that they could count on. The Mexican War began with Texas. Since gaining its independence from Spain in 1821, the Mexican government had, through land grants and other incentives, encouraged Anglo settlers and traders to relocate to Texas. Many people from the American South and West did so. The Mexicans wanted the Anglos to help revitalize the economy and, as they were reputed to be rough, combative types, to help them fight the Comanches and other warlike Indian tribes. The Anglos did all that, but they also brought with them their own sense of political and legal rights. Mexican attempts to encroach on those rights they regarded as tyranny. In 1830, the Mexican government halted Anglo immigration into Texas, imposed custom duties, reorganized the governmental structure of Texas, and set up new military garrisons there. By this time, a majority of people in Texas were Anglos, not Mexicans. Historian Daniel Walker Howe estimates that in 1830, Anglos in Texas outnumbered Hispanic Tejanos by more than 2 to 1. Sam Houston, who had emigrated to Texas from Tennessee, wrote President Andrew Jackson about the difficulty of dealing with the Mexican government. Mexico is involved in civil war. The federal constitution has never been in operation. The government is essentially despotic. Led by Houston, the Texans decided to break away from Mexico. They weren't being ornery or recalcitrant. Historian H.W. Brands reminds us that the Americans who moved to Texas had been induced to do so as settlers. Mexico's ban on new immigration meant that Texas could remain a frontier society indefinitely. But according to Brand, very few Americans, even among Westerners, loved the frontier for its own sake. They migrated to the unsettled regions because they could afford land there, but no sooner did they purchase their plots than they wanted the frontier to look like the settled regions back east. Nearly all the Americans in Texas had assumed that more of their compatriots would follow them there, and that the Texas frontier would fill with towns and eventually cities, and the rising standard of living towns and cities entailed. In sum, these were poor settlers who were looking for a better life, and that prospect seemed thwarted by the actions of the Mexican government, which was centralizing authority at the expense of Mexico's states. In 1836, the Texans revolted, proclaiming Texas the Lone Star Republic. This wasn't purely a white or Anglo rebellion. Historian David Montejano points out that the rebellion was brought about through an alliance of the newcomer Anglo-colonists and the established Texas-Mexican elite. Originally, the Texan revolt was not an attempt at secession. Rather, the rebels demanded that Mexico live up to the Mexican Constitution of 1824, which granted the states a large degree of autonomy. But General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, Mexico's dictator since 1829, was not about to do this. It was only when Mexico ignored the Texan demands, responding with force, that the Texans decided on a complete separation from Mexico. There is an interesting echo here of the American Revolution, which began as a protest against British misrule, the deprivation of the rights of Englishmen, but eventually became a movement for full independence and to affirm the universal rights of man. In the same vein, the Texans started out by trying to be good Mexicans, and when that didn't work, they broke away and drafted a new constitution modeled on that of the United States. The Texans petitioned the United States for help in their war against the Mexican government. Oddly enough, none came. President Andrew Jackson, despite his reputation as an expansionist, rejected intervention on behalf of the Texans. Even when the Texans won and became a republic, the U.S. refused to admit Texas as a state, largely because of Northern concerns that the admission of Texas would strengthen the slave power of the American South. So Texas remained an independent republic for about a decade. Finally, in 1845, Texas received admission into the United States. Now it was a matter of settling the border between Texas and Mexico. It was the disputed claims between the Texans and the Mexicans over where Mexico ended and Texas began that set off the Mexican War. Mexico claimed the border was the Nueces River, while Texans insisted it was the Rio Grande. On balance, the Mexicans appear to have had the stronger case, yet for almost a decade they made no effort to enforce it, allowing Texas free access to the larger territory it claimed. Upon admitting Texas as a state, President Polk sent a delegation of U.S. troops to the Rio Grande to inspect the border. The Mexicans ambushed an American patrol, thus precipitating the Mexican War. The Mexican War, though popular among the American people, was controversial and divided the country's leaders. The abolitionist Frederick Douglass was opposed, attributing it to America's cupidity and love of dominion. Ralph Waldo Emerson thought it unwise and imperialist. Thoreau refused to pay his Massachusetts poll tax on the grounds that it would help fund the Mexican War. He was jailed for a night while a relative paid the tax and obtained his release. By contrast, Walt Whitman argued that Mexico was the aggressor, and therefore, Mexico must be thoroughly chastised. Congressman Abraham Lincoln opposed the war, as did his mentor Henry Clay. The Whig position against expansion. Whigs generally believed that America should set an example of a free republic rather than expand its boundaries. In the 1844 presidential election, the Whig candidate Henry Clay lost to the Democrat James Polk in part because Clay opposed admitting Texas to the Union. Clay later condemned the Mexican War as motivated by a lust for conquest and a spirit of universal dominion. By contrast, the Democrats favored extending freedom by enlarging the boundaries of the United States through purchase and treaty when possible, through force when warranted. This debate was complicated by the slavery issue. Southerners wanted the country to get bigger so they could add more slave states. Northerners wanted to ensure that any additions to America would be free states rather than slave states. Lincoln contended that President Polk had found an excuse to go to war with Mexico by falsely claiming that Mexicans had shed American blood on American soil. Lincoln introduced sarcastic spot resolutions, demanding that Polk identify the precise spot on which the blood had been spilled. Even so, Lincoln's position had its own nuance. Lincoln never disputed that the Mexican government was tyrannical, or that the Texans had a right to assert their independence. If Americans had a right to revolt against British rule, surely the Texans had a right to throw off the tyranny of the Mexican oligarchs. Later, in his Mexican War speech on January 12, 1848, Lincoln would proclaim the Declaration of Independence to be a most valuable, a most sacred right, a right which, we hope and believe, is to liberate the world. Lincoln's argument in opposition to the war was merely that it had been started under false pretexts, and that Polk had gone beyond defending Texas to coveting Mexican territory. The war was short and decisive. The Mexicans were commanded by General Santa Anna, who had led the successful Mexican revolt against Spain, but Santa Anna was no match for the United States forces, led by Generals Zachary Taylor and Winfield Scott. Taylor would later become President of the United States, and Scott, the highest-ranking general in the Army. Junior officers in the American Army included such familiar names as Ulysses Grant, George McClellan, Stonewall Jackson, Robert E. Lee, and Jefferson Davis, future Civil War adversaries, now fighting on the same side. The war ended in 1847, when the Mexican capital fell to the United States. The United States flag flew over Mexico City, which was occupied by the U.S. Army for 9 months. Ultimately, the Americans withdrew, and the peace was secured by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which settled the Texas border and granted the United States a vast area extending from the present states of New Mexico to California to Wyoming. America, however, could have kept all of Mexico. The United States decided to keep half and give half back. How to assess the Mexican War? I don't feel sorry for the Mexican government, which started the war and lost the war, nor will I deny that this was in part an American war of conquest that added 1.5 million square miles to the territory of the United States. Who suffered as a consequence of the war? Howard Zinn, performing History from Below, focuses on the small number of American soldiers who refused to fight because they opposed America's involvement in the war. Motivated by opposition to the war, and also by land grants offered to defectors by the Mexican government, around 300 American soldiers joined the Mexican army. So a small contingent of soldiers quit or switched sides. Who cares? The real issue is the impact on Mexicans who were directly affected by the war. We have to consider what became of them and their descendants. Consider the claims we hear today about how Mexicans merely want to return and work on their own land that was unjustly taken. But no land was taken from them at all. After the war, the United States immediately recognized as valid the property rights of Mexicans who were now part of U.S. territory. The change was not in any individual's land ownership, but in the fact that people who were once Mexicans now became Americans. Normally, it is a lengthy process to become an American citizen. I know because as an immigrant I went through it myself. Yet according to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the Mexicans who ended up on the American side were immediately made American citizens. Article 9 of the treaty guaranteed them all the rights of the citizens of the United States. This itself is historically unique. Of the three main involuntary minority groups, American Indians, blacks, and Mexicans, only Mexicans were offered immediate American citizenship. They were granted more rights, including more secure property rights, than they had ever enjoyed before. There is probably some truth to Robert Rosenbaum's claim that, as a consequence of the war, most Mexicanos in the United States lost their freedom to live as they wanted to live. Rosenbaum is the author of Mexicano Resistance in the Southwest. He documents several cases, not numerous but significant, in which Mexicans fought against American occupation. Rosenbaum also notes that full citizenship and property rights did not result in economic opportunity or social integration for Mexicanos. Besides the differences in language and culture, there was nativism and discrimination to contend with. Even so, Mexican Americans enjoyed more opportunity to improve their lives than they would have in Mexico. They now enjoyed the whole set of rights under the U.S. Constitution, including the right to self-government. Political scientist Harry Jaffa writes, "The accessions of parts of Mexico to the United States did not mean a denial of self-government to the inhabitants of these regions, but the first effective assurance of self-government they would have had." Mexicans have always enjoyed a preferred status in U.S. immigration policy, and not just because of the country's proximity to America. In the 1920s, the United States passed immigration restrictions, imposing quota limits on immigration from most countries, but there were no limits on Mexican immigration. Mexicans, in fact, were racially classified as white for the purposes of immigration policy. Today, despite the high number of legal immigrants America takes from Mexico, a majority of illegal immigrants also come from that country. Remarkably, had America retained control of all of Mexico, those illegals wouldn't have to cross the border. They would already be U.S. citizens. While progressives deplore American aggression, one wonders whether there are Mexicans who wish America had been more aggressive. What we do know is that the vast majority of Mexicans who ended up on the American side of the border following the Mexican War never attempted to return to Mexico, and neither have their descendants. Let not America go wrong in her first hour. Christopher Newport, The New World. The road up the mountain was steep and winding, on our way to see the woman who wanted to get rid of Mount Rushmore. She was an American Indian activist, a leader of the Sioux tribe. As we approached the destination for our interview, which is featured in my America movie, I thought about how Columbus's landing in America changed the world. Imagine if there was no America, and Columbus kept going. He might have landed in his intended destination, India. That would have changed history a little, but only a little. The reason is that India was already a long-established civilization. At best, Columbus would have set up one more trading post. The America landing, by contrast, opened up a new continent, not only to European occupation and settlement, but also to the founding of a new country. the United States of America. Today, in the schools, the progressives emphasize that Columbus didn't discover America. He couldn't have, since there were already people here. Rather, they say Columbus conquered America. Yes, well, we're going to get into the issue of conquest, but let's begin by pondering the discovery question. Rarely do the progressive pedants ponder the significance that it was Europeans who landed here in America, not native peoples from this continent who landed on the shores of Europe. If native Indians could have conquered Europe and sailed up the Thames or the Seine, would they not have done so? Of course they would. But they didn't, because they couldn't. It's worth asking why things happened the way they did. We were in the Black Hills region of South Dakota, where the carved faces of Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, and Teddy Roosevelt emerge unexpectedly out of a mountain. It's an oddly thrilling sight, made even more special for me because I got to fly in a helicopter and see Rushmore from the sky, coming almost face to face with the four presidents. Mount Rushmore is a popular site for visitors, and the town has become a kind of trading post, selling cowboy hats, holsters, and all kinds of Wild West paraphernalia. During the day there are stage shootouts, and in the evening the beer flows in the bars, and country singers sing songs from another era, such as "You Picked a Fine Time to Leave Me, Lucille." Charmaine Whiteface is a Sioux Indian and a spokesperson for the tribe's National Council. She hates Mount Rushmore and wants to see it disappear. Whiteface is a small woman, a little frail even, and I could hardly imagine her setting off explosives to blow up Mount Rushmore. She said she wouldn't get rid of it that way, although there may be other native Indian activists who would happily light the fuse. Whiteface would prefer that Mount Rushmore not be maintained. A monument requires constant preservation, she points out. Rushmore, she says, should simply be abandoned. That way, nature would take its course, and erosion would first obscure and eventually eliminate those four iconic faces. To Whiteface, they are the faces of tyranny, conquest, and genocide. Genocide is a strong word. It suggests not only murder on a massive scale, but also the desire to wipe out an entire people. Whiteface believes it, and she believes it goes back to Columbus and the white settlement of the Americas. She's not alone. Russell Means, the American Indian activist, has said that Columbus makes Hitler look like a juvenile delinquent. Writer Winona LaDuke deplores the biological, technological, and ecological invasion that began with Columbus's ill-fated voyage 500 years ago. Writer Svetan Torodov faults Columbus and other European invaders with producing the greatest genocide in human history. Historian Glenn Morris accuses Columbus of being a murderer, a rapist, the architect of a policy of genocide that continues today. Literary scholar Stephen Greenblatt claims that Columbus inaugurated the greatest experiment in political, economic, and cultural cannibalism in the history of the Western world. The Native American indictment can be summed up this way. The white man systematically killed us off and then stole our country. Whiteface wants the country back. Specifically, she wants the Black Hills to be returned to the Sioux, who had it before it was taken by the United States government in violation of its treaty obligations. There have been court cases about this, and the Sioux seem to have a valid claim. An 1868 treaty affirms that the Black Hills are set apart for the absolute and undisturbed use and occupation of the Indians. Yet the treaty was abrogated by Congress in 1877. The courts have recognized this and awarded the tribe money, lots of it. Currently there is more than $1 billion on offer to the Sioux. The money continues to gather interest. That's because the Sioux won't take it. The Sioux don't want money, insisting that the Black Hills are not for sale. The Sioux position, conveyed by Whiteface, is that the land needs to be returned. It needs to become tribal land again. Whiteface showed me what used to be several ancient sacred sites where the great spirits dwell, and she wants those sites restored so Sioux people can once again commune with the spirits. I reminded Whiteface that before the Sioux, there were Cheyenne Indians and other tribes on that land. So if America stole the land from the Sioux, didn't the Sioux steal the land from the Cheyenne and other tribes? If the land is returned to the Sioux, shouldn't the Sioux turn around and give it back to those who had it before? Whiteface looked flustered. She said that long before the white man came, American Indians had certain dominant tribes, and the Sioux happened to be one of them. Some tribes were in charge, and that's all there was to that. If the land was returned to the Sioux, she said, perhaps the tribe would let the Cheyenne and others worship at the holy sites. But how did these dominant tribes become dominant? Whiteface's euphemistic rhetoric aside, they became dominant by defeating the weaker and smaller tribes. So the Sioux indeed got land in the typical way that Indians got land, by defeating and displacing the previous inhabitants. Stronger, warlike tribes like the Sioux, the Apache, and the Comanche have always done it, and weaker Pacific tribes like the Hopi and the Pueblo have always known it. Here, in a nutshell, we see the problem of asserting a "we got here first" land claim. Almost inevitably, there was someone who was there earlier who can assert the same claim against you. We'll come back to this, but for now let's move to Columbus and the charge of genocide. The historical Columbus was a Christian explorer. Howard Zinn makes it sound like Columbus came looking for nothing but gold, but Columbus was equally driven by a spirit of exploration and adventure. When we read Columbus's diaries, we see that his motives were complex. He wanted to get rich by discovering new trade routes, but he also wanted to find the Garden of Eden, which he believed was an actual undiscovered place. Of course, Columbus didn't come looking for America. He didn't know that the American continent existed. Since the Muslims controlled the trade routes of the Arabian Sea, he was looking for a new way to the Far East. Specifically, he was looking for India, and that's why he called the native peoples Indians. It's easy to laugh at Columbus's naivete, except that he wasn't entirely wrong. Anthropological research has established that the native people of the Americas did originally come from Asia. Most likely they came across the Bering Strait before the continents drifted apart. We know that, as a consequence of contact with Columbus and the Europeans who came after him, the native population in the Americas plummeted. By some estimates, more than 80% of the Indians perished. This is the basis for the charge of genocide. But there was no genocide. Millions of Indians died as a result of diseases they contracted from their exposure to the white man: smallpox, measles, cholera, and typhus. There is one isolated allegation of Sir Jeffrey Amherst, whose name graces Amherst College, approving a strategy to vanquish a hostile Indian tribe by giving the Indians smallpox-infected blankets. Even here, however, it's not clear the scheme was actually carried out. As historian William McNeill documents in Plagues and Peoples, the white man generally transmitted his diseases to the Indians without knowing it, and the Indians died in large numbers because they had not developed immunities to those diseases. This is tragedy on a grand scale, but it is not genocide, because genocide implies an intention to wipe out a people. McNeill points out that Europeans themselves had contracted lethal diseases, including the pneumonic and bubonic plagues from the Mongol invaders of the Asian steppes. The Europeans didn't have immunities, and during the Black Death of the 14th century, 1/3 of the population of Europe was wiped out. But no one called these plagues genocide, because they weren't. It's true that Columbus developed strong prejudices about the native peoples he first encountered. He was prejudiced in favor of them. He praised the intelligence, generosity, and lack of guile among the Tainos, contrasting these qualities with Spanish vices. Subsequent explorers such as Pedro Alvarez Cabral, Amerigo Vespucci, from whom we get the name America, and Walter Raleigh registered similar positive impressions. So where did Europeans get the idea that Indians were savages? Actually, they got it from their experience with the Indians. While the Indians Columbus met on his first voyage were hospitable and friendly, on subsequent voyages, Columbus was horrified to discover that a number of sailors he had left behind had been killed and possibly eaten by the cannibalistic Arawaks. When Bernal Diaz arrived in Mexico with the swashbuckling army of Hernan Cortez, he and his fellow Spaniards saw things they had never seen before. Indeed, they witnessed one of the most gruesome spectacles ever seen, something akin to what American soldiers saw after World War II when they entered the Nazi concentration camps. As Diaz describes the Aztecs, in an account generally corroborated by modern scholars, "They strike open the wretched Indian's chest with flint knives, and hastily tear out the palpitating heart, which, with the blood, they present to the idols in whose name they have performed the sacrifice. They then cut off the arms, thighs, and head, eating the arms and thighs at their ceremonial banquets." Huge numbers of Indians, typically captives in war, were sacrificed, sometimes hundreds in a single day. Yet in a comic attempt to diminish the cruelty of the Aztecs, Howard Zinn remarks that their mass murder did not erase a certain innocence, and he accuses Cortez of nefarious conduct, turning Aztec against Aztec. If the Aztecs of Mexico seemed especially bloodthirsty, they were rivaled by the Incas of South America, who also erected sacrificial mounds on which they performed elaborate rites of human sacrifice, so that their altars were drenched with blood, Bones were strewn everywhere, and priests collapsed from exhaustion from stabbing their victims. Even while the Europeans were startled and appalled at such bloodthirstiness, there was a countercurrent of admiration for what Europeans saw as the Indians' better qualities. Starting with Columbus and continuing through the next few centuries, native Indians were regarded as noble savages. They were admired for their dignity, stoicism, and bravery. In reality, the native Indians probably had these qualities in the same proportion as human beings elsewhere on the planet. The idealization of them as noble savages seems to be a projection of European fantasies about primitive innocence onto the natives. We too, and especially modern progressives, have the same fantasies. Unlike us, however, the Spanish were forced to confront the reality of Aztec and Inca behavior. Today we have an appreciation for the achievements of Aztec and Inca culture, such as its social organization and temple architecture, but we cannot fault the Spanish for being distracted by the mass murder they witnessed. Not all the European hostility to the Indians was the result of irrational prejudice. While the Spanish conquistadores were surprised to see humans sacrificed in droves, they were not shocked to witness slavery, the subjugation of women, or brutal treatment of war captives. These were familiar enough practices from their own culture. Moreover, in conquering the Indians and establishing alien rule over them, the Spanish were doing to the Indians nothing more than the Indians had done to each other. So, from the point of view of the native Indian people, one empire, that of Spain, replaced another, that of the Aztecs. Did life for the native Indian get worse? It's very hard to say. The ordinary Indian might now have a higher risk of disease, but he certainly had a lower risk of finding himself under the lurid glare of the obsidian knife. What then distinguished the Spanish from the Indians? The Peruvian writer and Nobel laureate Mario Vargas Llosa offers an arresting answer. The conquistadores who came to the Americas, he concedes, were semi-literate, implacable, and greedy. They were clearly believers in the conquest ethic. Land is yours if you can take it. Yet these semi-literate, greedy swordsmen, without knowing it, also brought with them something new to the Americas. They brought with them the ideas of Western civilization, from Athenian rationalism to Judeo-Christian ideas of human brotherhood to more modern conceptions of self-government, human rights, and property rights. Some of these ideas were nascent and newly developing even in the West. Nevertheless, they were there, and without intending to do so, the conquistadores brought them to the Americas. To appreciate what Vargas Llosa is saying, consider an astonishing series of events that took place in Spain in the early 16th century. At the urging of a group of Spanish clergy, the King of Spain called a halt to Spanish expansion in the Americas, pending the resolution of the question of whether American Indians had souls and could be justly enslaved. This seems odd and even appalling to us today, but we should not miss its significance. Historian Louis Hanka writes that never before or since has a powerful emperor ordered his conquests to cease until it was decided if they were just. The king's actions were in response to petitions by a group of Spanish priests led by Bartolomé de las Casas. Las Casas defended the Indians in a famous debate held at Valladolid in Spain. On the other side was an Aristotelian scholar, Juan Sepulveda, who relied on Aristotle's concept of the natural slave to argue that Indians were inferior and therefore could be subjugated. Las Casas countered that Indians were human beings with the same dignity and spiritual nature as the Spanish. Today, Las Casas is portrayed as a heroic eccentric, but his basic position prevailed at Valladolid. It was endorsed by the Pope, who declared in his bull Sublimus Deus, "Indians are by no means to be deprived of their liberty or the possessions of their property, nor should they be in any way enslaved. Should the contrary happen, it shall be null and of no effect." Papal bulls and even royal edicts were largely ignored thousands of miles away. There were no effective mechanisms of enforcement. The conquest ethic prevailed. Even so, over time the principles of Valladolid and Sublimus Deus provided the moral foundation for the enfranchisement of Indians. Indians could themselves appeal to Western ideas of equality, dignity, and property rights in order to resist subjugation, enforce treaties, and get some of their land back. It is against this backdrop that we should consider the question of whether the white man stole the Americas from the Indians. Let's begin by appreciating the ambiguity of the term theft in this context. The abolitionist Frederick Douglass, in his autobiography, tells the story of how, as a slave, he stole food from his master. Douglass impishly points out that in extracting meat from the tub, he wasn't really stealing. That's because, as a slave, he wasn't considered a human being. He was considered his master's property. but the master's provisions were also the master's property. So Douglas says that far from stealing from his master, he was merely taking his meat out of one tub and putting it in another. The point of this anecdote is that concepts of theft only make sense when there is a built-in infrastructure of ownership, property rights, and morality. Theft requires that someone legitimately owns something so that it is possible for someone else to illegitimately take it. If I steal your corn and it turns out it wasn't your corn, you stole it from someone else, then I have indeed committed theft, but not against you, only against the person who actually owns the corn. Theft with respect to the Indians is rendered problematic because the Indians themselves had no concept of property rights. The Indians held that no one actually owns land. Land is the common property of all. Who then gets to use the land? Naturally, it is the one who is occupying it. This picture was further complicated by the fact that there were two types of Indian tribes, the sedentary agricultural tribes and the nomadic hunting tribes. The sedentary tribes cultivated the land, and seemingly by occupation they were its rightful owners. The hunting tribes, since they moved around, occupied no particular place. Over time, however, the hunting tribes used their martial skills to defeat and displace the sedentary tribes. They then became the new sedentary tribes, and their claim to the land was also based on an occupancy. Of course, there were constant clashes among tribes. No one wanted to be ejected from their land. Everyone understood, however, that there was no real basis for complaint, since it wasn't their land in the first place. When everyone is a renter, use is solely according to possession. This is the conquest ethic in its purest form. The white men who settled America didn't come as foreign invaders. They came as settlers. Unlike the Spanish, who ruled Mexico from afar, the English families who arrived in America left everything behind and staked their lives on the New World. In other words, they came as immigrants. We can say, of course, that immigration doesn't confer any privileges, and just because you come here to settle doesn't mean you have a right to the land that is here. But then, that logic would also apply to the Indians. Let's recall that the Indians who were here also once came as immigrants. In the beginning, there was no one here, and then the Indians came from Asia or someplace else and themselves discovered the New World. Does this mean that the Indians owned America because they got here first? To see this question in its clear light, consider the biblical story of Cain and Abel. Abel was a shepherd while Cain was a farmer. Abel moved around with flocks while Cain cultivated the earth. Now imagine that each day, while Abel tended livestock, Cain built fences and said, "This is mine and this is also mine," until Cain has enclosed all the existing land, while Abel continues as a shepherd. Does this mean that the descendants of Cain, owning to their original occupation of the earth, own the whole world? In his Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, Rousseau suggested that the first man to build a fence around something and say, "This is mine," was the original con artist. Rousseau raises the question of how one can claim to own something in perpetuity simply by occupying and claiming it. To understand the legitimacy of property rights, we have to see the justice in Rousseau's comment. If ownership of the globe is not first come, first served, then how does an individual, or a tribe, or a nation get to declare that it owns land and that everyone else who tries to occupy it or use it is a usurper? It would be nice to turn to an American Indian source for doctrine on the origin of property rights, but no such source exists. The white man who displaced the Indians also brought with him that doctrine, not to mention courts of law to enforce it, which ultimately enabled the Indian to challenge the white man's occupation on the basis of the white man's own doctrine. What then was that doctrine? In the ancient and medieval world, just as in the Americas, there was no clear notion of property rights. People owned property, but the idea that they had a right to it would have been regarded as absurd. The ancient view of property was summed up in Cicero's analogy. Owning a piece of land or property is like occupying a seat in a public theater. It's your seat, but only while you are sitting in it. You don't own it, and even its possession comes with certain duties and obligations. The ancients also assumed that the amount of land, like the number of seats in a theater, is generally fixed, so it's not right to take up more space than you need.